This lesson, the final teachings of Jesus, obviously he taught his disciples after his resurrection, and he taught through them as well. But as far as before his crucifixion, these would be the final things that he taught and did with his disciples. So in Mark chapter 13 and verse 1, as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be overthrown." As we look at Mark 13, let's think about how this is going to progress and give you just a real quick overview of what Jesus is going to be teaching about. This is the longest single section of Jesus' teaching found in the Gospel of Mark. There are about 34 of the 37 verses where Jesus is speaking directly. And most of it is going to be about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem itself, verses 1 through 31. And then Jesus will also say some things, I believe, about the end of time. Verse 30 will be the break point between those two events, between talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of time. We'll see that when we get there in just a minute. So the destruction of Jerusalem, of course, is a critical point in biblical history. It was prophesied, and here it's being prophesied by Jesus. It's an important fact of history, certainly for the Jews. In this event, which would happen about 35 years or so after Jesus prophesied it, God's power and purpose for punishing disobedient Israel are going to be clearly seen. And Jesus' foreknowledge of the event truly demonstrates him to be the Son of God. A couple of other things about the destruction of the temple is that as the disciples point out these stones that Jesus, and they have been looking at it, admiring, Jesus says that not one of those stones is going to be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. This is all going to be destroyed, he's saying. And on the Mount of Olives then, just a little bit later, in verses 3 and 4, he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Then Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" And they want to know when this is going to happen. When will the temple be destroyed? When will Jerusalem be destroyed? Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, and from the Mount of Olives, you could have just looked right across the valley, the Kidron Valley, and seen the temple. In fact, at one point, you could have looked straight into the Holy of Holies if the door was open, depending on where they were on the Mount of Olives. So this discourse of Jesus, sometimes called the Olivet Discourse because it was on the Mount of Olives, again, mainly having to do with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then also talking some about his second coming. But Jesus warns of a number of coming events. The temple was, at this period of time, undergoing major reconstruction. It had been begun by Herod in about 20 BC. In John chapter 2 and verse 20, the Jews say that at that point, when they were discussing with Jesus, that it had been building for 46 years. It would go on for another 20 years or so. It wasn't really finished even when Jesus walked in it. The temple was made of huge stones. Josephus, who was a Jew, who later wrote Jewish history for the Romans, walked in that temple, saw it being destroyed according to his own testimony. But he says that the temple was built of hard white stones, each of which was about 25 cubits in length. That's over 37 feet long, and 8 cubits in height. That's 12 feet high. So huge stones weighing many tons. And so it was truly a marvelous bit of architecture. And it's no wonder that the disciples admired it. But Jesus is more interested in letting them know about its coming destruction. No doubt it was a beautiful place physically, but it was going to be destroyed, and it was going to be destroyed because of the Jews' disobedience to God. And so we continue on, Mark chapter 13 and verse 5. Jesus answers their question. He says, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name saying, 'I am he,' and will deceive many." So Jesus is going to warn of coming events that are not necessarily indicative of the temple about to be destroyed. He's saying there are a number of things that are going to happen. These are not signs that the temple is going to be destroyed. These are not signs that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, so don't take them to be signs. But here are some things that are going to happen between, when he's speaking that time there and when it is destroyed. So he says one of the things that's going to happen is there'll be false Christs that will arise. People will come and say that they are the Christ, and Jesus says don't be deceived by that. Don't be led astray by that. And then he says in verse 7, when you hear wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen. The end is not yet. So again, there are going to be wars. There are going to be all sorts of things going on in the world. That doesn't mean the temple is going to be destroyed or the end of time is coming or anything. That's just a part of the process of things. Nations are going to rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines and troubles. These are the beginning of sorrows. So that's not what Jesus is talking about as far as the destruction of the temple is concerned. There'll be all kinds of things that are going on before it comes, but just because these things happen doesn't mean that the destruction of the temple is imminent. But he says in verse 9, watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you to councils. You will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. Jesus is plainly saying the disciples are going to suffer persecution, and the gospel is going to be preached to the whole world. Again, that's going to happen before the destruction of Jerusalem would occur. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Colossians in Colossians chapter 1, in verses 5 and 6, and also in verse 23, indicates that at that time when he wrote to the Colossians in the 60s AD, that the gospel had been preached to the world according to the instructions of Christ. He says in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 5 about the truth of the gospel, he says, it has come to you as it has to the whole world, or in all the world. And in Colossians 1 and verse 23, he speaks about the hope of the gospel, which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven. So Paul asserts that the gospel by the early 60s AD had been preached to the whole world. Of course, the temple in Jerusalem wasn't destroyed till 70 AD. So certainly Jesus' prophecy there about the gospel first being preached to the whole world came true. And then he talks about how the apostles would receive divine help from God as they suffered persecution and went about preaching the gospel. He says in verse 11, when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak, but whatever is given you in that hour, speak that, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Now please notice this is a promise that's given specifically to the apostles for the time frame in which the gospel was first being preached to the whole world. These men had the ability to perform miracles. They would be baptized in the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. So these were Jesus' special messengers. He says to them, brother will betray brother to death, a father his child, children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. So these are some of the things that are going to happen before the temple would be destroyed. And then he gets to the point in verse 14 where he talks about, okay,